So as I was kind of looking at this story and reading it and rereading it and trying to figure out, all right, how do we actually create a sermon around it? I actually wrote on the top of my paper the first time, nothing in this story is right. And then as I read it again and again, I then wrote next to that, this story is a mess. And if I've learned anything about life, it's that when something is a mess, it can always get messier. I'll tell you what I mean, or explain to you what I mean. In the winter of 05 to 06, at some point in that period, when Katie and I were living in St. Louis and I was going to seminary, we had one of those infamous St. Louis ice storms. Now, if you've ever lived in St. Louis, I'm sorry to hear that. For those of you who have not, don't. But if you have, you'll know what I'm talking about. We don't often get didn't often get like those pretty winter wonderland snowstorms. It was ice. Like the storm would come through and it would just cover everything in ice. And it was dangerous and cold and inconvenient. So right after this ice storm, I think it was our first one since living there, that morning I was doing dishes. And, miracle of miracles, right? I remembered. And I was washing a knife that I had been using to cut raw chicken the night before. And, washing it and then sliced my hand open. So a literal mess, right? So as I'm trying to kind of mop up and get like paper towels and get the bleeding to stop, but I was having a hard time doing so. At that point, I had pretty advanced leukemia, and we knew it by that point. And one of the features of leukemia that is kind of advanced is that it can be really hard to stop bleeding. So I'm getting paper towels and wrapping it and kind of trying to compress it, do all the tricks. I couldn't get my wife's help because she was at work and it would have been really tricky for her to get back to our apartment. So I'm going, and at some point I realized, all right, I need to call my oncologist. So I do, and I talk to one of the nurses. And she's like, yeah, go to the ER. And I'm like, no, I think I don't need to, because I think if I can just get the bleeding to stop, is there anything? No, I think you need to go to the ER. That knife is contaminated. You're severely compromised in your immune system. No, I think I'll be whatever. And after a while, it's like, okay, I should probably go to the ER. So I get to my car, sit down, and I've got like a roll of paper towels, and I've got paper towels wrapped around my hand, and I have to keep adding more, and I'm pressing it against my ceiling, or the ceiling of the car, trying to get the bleeding to stop. Now, I had lived in the South like almost my entire life, so I had never driven in ice and snow before, ever. So I'm sitting there in my car with my hand pressed against the ceiling, trying to get some bleeding to stop, while trying to remember like driver's ed, like, all right, what do I need to do in the ice? Like if I swerve, okay, go slow, getting the defroster to work, like that's like magic and stuff like that. With one hand, because the other hand was busy bleeding. My car at the time did not have power steering and was a stick shift. Like I say, a messy situation can always get messier. And we're going to see that happen here. This is the backstory of Moses. This is what happened before he's like the Moses that leads the Israelites out of Egypt. And the backdrop is that the Hebrew people were living in Egypt, and they were growing as a people group in a foreign land. And Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, who is identified as an actual god on earth for the Egyptians, recognizes that this is a threat to national security. Because if Egypt were to go to war against another Semitic people, that would raise the question of, well, what's going to happen with the Hebrews? Are they going to suddenly turn on us? Will we have like a two-front war? Like, what's going to happen? So, in order to control these people, he enslaves them. But it doesn't work because they still grow in numbers. So then he orders like all of the male children to be killed by the midwives. And the midwives go to Pharaoh and they're like, well, hey, the Hebrew women are strong. They give birth before we can even get there. A bit of a lie, but I think in this case it's quite justified. It's either lie or kill children. And then, Pharaoh says, all right, fine. When the Hebrew babies or baby boys are born, throw them into the Nile. So again, a messy situation gets messier and messier. And with that, Moses is born. And his mother tries to hide him. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. She placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. So she throws him in the Nile River. It's just also with a little boat. Now, the practice described here is essentially exposure. It was an ancient practice where if a baby is born that you don't want, you can't take care of it for whatever reason, you just kind of leave it out and let nature take its course. It's horrifying and barbaric, but it was a reality for the ancient world, although not amongst this weird group of people that emerged in the ancient world called Christians, interestingly enough. But anyway, she puts this baby in this little boat, and he starts floating down the Nile. And what she's hoping for is that as other women, Egyptian women, come to bathe or do the wash or something like that, they'll see him, they'll have pity, and they'll rescue him. And that's what happens, only it's the Pharaoh's daughter. So the Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. Now, we learned a couple verses ago that he was an attractive baby, which is kind of weird because all newborn babies look like aliens to me, but that's fine. So it works. She has pity on this child, and for some reason she recognizes that he's a Hebrew. So Pharaoh's daughter says to Moses' mother, they eventually track her down, take this baby and nurse him for me and I will pay you, which is actually a little bit of Hebrew humor there. She's twisted the situation around so that Pharaoh's daughter is paying Moses' mother to nurse her own son. That's kind of like a we got the imperial powers. Like we've manipulated this situation to our advantage. So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. So think about the mess so far. The Hebrews are growing, but then they are enslaved. And then Pharaoh, this supposed God on earth, who we will learn over the course of the next several weeks, is arrogant and hard-headed and hard-hearted, orders the killing of children. And then when that doesn't work, a different method for the killing of children. And although Moses' mother works the situation so that she gets him for at least a little while until he's weaned, she loses her son. A messy situation gets messier and messier because this Pharaoh person is afraid of these Hebrews. So one day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor, which means he somehow knows that he is a Hebrew. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. So we as readers here probably know what's coming. Like, this is Moses, who God gave special command to lead his own covenant people out of slavery in Egypt. Through Moses, he performs miracles. Moses confronts Pharaoh to his face. Moses encounters the very presence of God on Mount Sinai. Moses speaks to God as one speaks to a friend. This is the most important prophet in the Bible. And the first time we see him as an adult, he murders somebody. That's messy. And then the next day, he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us?" There's a bit of irony there because the answer is, no one yet, but the Almighty God is about to. Just give it a chapter or two. Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian? Then Moses was afraid and thought, what I did must have become known. So now, again, take a step back. Because in the way the book of Exodus is written, there are certain points where you have to stop and ask yourself, okay, are we talking about this story here, or is there something else going on underneath? And I think this is one of those cases. So we've got Pharaoh, who thinks he's a god on earth, and he is deciding what is good and what is evil. And for him, what is good is killing Hebrew children. And the Hebrews are enslaved. They are forced to endure hard labor, and that is evil. But the Egyptians would call it good. But not only are the Hebrews enslaved under this evil force we might call Pharaoh, but they are also making a messy situation worse because they are tearing at themselves. I mean, at this point, Moses would be like the only guy who might be able to improve their situation. He's a son of the daughter of Pharaoh. So yeah, he's not technically in charge of them, but he knows some people. And yet at the same time, he is a murderer, and his own people are like, hey, get away from me, even though he might be able to help them out. We as human beings have a tendency to make our own messes so much worse because we are bad at recognizing our own best interests. And we have this compulsion to decide what is good and what is evil for ourselves. And in doing so, we end up tearing ourselves and those around us apart. The Bible calls that sin. This story of Pharaoh and Moses and the Hebrews fighting is not just a story about them. This is the story of humanity. One of the reasons why these writings have endured over thousands of years is that they so perfectly hold a mirror to the human condition. This is not simply a story to gawk at these Hebrews who don't recognize things, or Moses who murdered somebody, or Pharaoh who is using his power to decide what is good and evil. This is kind of our own story echoed in however many ways. Think about your own lives. When have you made a mess so much messier? Kind of like hey, don't do that, don't say that, that's not going to help, you're not going to improve the situation, this is not going to make things right, you know that's the wrong thing to do, and now your situation's so much worse. This is all of our story. So Moses has to get out of town. When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. And we don't know where Midian was. But a well would be a good choice because, for one, it has water and you need that to live. But two, the communities would kind of gather around wells, so he'd eventually find somebody. Now, a priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and fill the troughs to water their father's flock. Some shepherds came along and drove them away, but Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered their flock. So it's an interesting twist here, because Moses' impulsivity and his tendency toward violence actually works in his favor this time. Some bad shepherds are trying to kind of claim, I guess, the well for themselves. He chases them away, and then he actually helps these women out. And we don't have the rest of that story in the slides for the sake of time. But the father of those daughters says, "Hey, why are you home so early?" And they said, "Some guy beat up those bad shepherds, and it was really helpful." And he says, "Where is he? Invite him over for dinner." And then in the course of the dinner, he gives them one of his daughters to marry, like you do. And that's how Moses got his first real job. He was a shepherd for a while. It says during that long period. So you have Moses, who we know will be chosen by God, who makes a mess of things because he murders somebody, and is rejected by his own people because they don't recognize their own best interests. So everybody is doing the human thing and making a mess. And then he just goes off and shepherds for a long period. Now, during that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out. They've been slaves this whole time. And their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. So the whole point of this story is of the book of Exodus, at least the first half, is God rescuing his own people from slavery in Egypt. It is the defining moment for them. And this whole period of Moses being a shepherd in Midian, they are still enslaved. And God waits. So the thing that annoys me about God, and let me finish, look out for lightning. The thing that annoys me about God is that because we as human beings are bound to space and time and story, is that God chooses to act confined with space, time, and story for the most part. The big, divine, miraculous interventions happen, but if you look at the way the Bible is structured, they're kind of rare. And because of that, God acts with his own timing. And it is incredibly rare for that timing to be the timing that I want. As I read this and worked through it and meditated on it, the thing that I kept coming back to is, but your people are enslaved this whole time. They are suffering. They are being born, living, and dying under slavery. While Moses is acting as a shepherd, God, why aren't you acting yet? And I would ask you, when have you said that yourself? God, why haven't you acted yet? My life is a mess. This is a mess. I am groaning and suffering. I've made this mess so much worse because I don't trust your own timing and I want to decide what is good or evil. God, when will you act? But the funny thing about God's timing is that it is taking into account things that we could never see or know. So I imagine at this time the Hebrew slaves groaning and weeping and praying and crying for God's intervention. And in my own imagination, I see God saying, hold on, because what I have planned is so much better than what you have in mind. And the same is true for us. Think about the holiday that we just celebrated. After generations, after generation, after generation, God finally acts. But rather than just like sending a new Moses-like figure, which is one of the things that people were expecting God to do, God sends his son. And in this really weird, hard to understand way, this is God himself acting in and moving in history. But it took time to set up. And not only did it take time, but the story that God was developing by sending his own son, Jesus, was so much bigger and better. Rather than him sending like this hero or this warrior to beat up the bad guys, God was taking on our own messiness, our own sin, our own self-destruction, and taking it to the grave with him. And when God defeated death by raising Jesus from the dead, nothing has been the same since. Human history hinges on that moment. My own life hinges on that moment. Because I'm a mess, and God has saved me. So as this story of Moses plays out, we have here like Pharaoh lurking in the background. And there will come a time when when Moses confronts Pharaoh to his face. But for now, this backstory is God setting it up. And his people wait. But now we know they are waiting with the promise that God is faithful to do what he said he would do. Because in God's timing, his redemption and his rescue are so much bigger and so much better than what we would have imagined. Let's pray.